Well, it's my pleasure to be with you tonight. I want to start with a Bible verse that I think and hope will be familiar to us. If not, we talked this morning a little bit about memorizing some Bible verses. This is a good one to add to the memory verse. If you don't know John 14:6, Jesus says, "On the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father except through me." We could spend some time talking about the second verse or the second sentence in that verse. Jesus makes a claim of exclusivity. He's the only way to the Father. Now, it's weird that we are in an era in American history that there are people in the church that need to know, right? Not all ways are going to lead to heaven, right? Jesus exclusively says he's the only way. Let's go further though. Jesus also identified that he is truth. This is so important because we live in a culture that is not sure truth even exists anymore, right? We are debating about, does truth exist? All of us, I mean, if you back up a couple years, we never would have thought. People are actually confused about the difference between a boy and a girl. Like, what world are we living in? But the reason that some of this matters, understand, the battle for truth is a battle for Jesus. Okay, this is very important because in a world that says truth is subjective, right? Or it's up to the individual. Well, this is my truth. If truth becomes subjective, if there's no objective standards, if there's no objective truth and reality, how do you share the gospel with someone that says, well, that's fine for you, but that's not my truth? Understand, if we cannot recognize and defend that truth exists, then it becomes a very challenging scenario for us to even go and make disciples if we cannot defend the line that truth does exist. Now, also keep in mind, when you go to Genesis and you see the devil, right? First time he's in this form of a serpent and he comes. What does the devil do? What's his first attack? It's an attack on truth. Did God really say? Yes, God really said. Why would the devil target truth? Because remember what Jesus told the disciples truth did? John 8:32, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. We have never seen a time in American history where the rising generation has been more bound, more confused, more lied to, more depressed. You can go down the list. The truth is what sets people free, right? Jesus said he was the truth, and truth is what sets people free. Now, I'm giving this for context because we are going to spend way more time talking about history, but I want to set the tone for why does this even matter? Because the lies being told in history are just an example of lies being told in culture. And if we say, well, no, some lies aren't really worth defending, right? So it's okay to believe some lies. No. We should stand for truth, whether we're talking about biology or history or theology. We have to start standing up for truth. And again, for those of you that know this book, none of us would have thought years ago that this would become one of the most prophetic books written from the 1950s. But there was a book written back in the 1950s by George Orwell called 1984. If you're not familiar with it, go read it and be shocked by how much he got right. Well, in the book 1984, one of the things Orwell said is who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. Now, the quick breakdown of it, who controls the present controls the past. The people that are in charge of the educational institutions today, they're controlling the narrative about the past, right? Because what we are hearing today, the rising generations coming from school, well, America's evil, America's this and this and that. Well, that's a narrative being controlled by the people that are in charge of the institutions. And now why would they even care about this? What Orwell pointed out is whoever controls the past controls the future. If you can raise up a generation that thinks America is fundamentally evil, right, the most racist nation, whatever kind of accusations they're going to give, if you think America is fundamentally an evil nation, then one of the most moral things you could do is try to destroy that evil thing. This is a Marxist playbook, like living out in front of us right now, but this is what we are seeing, right? And this is, again, it's part of why history matters. Knowing the truth actually matters in these scenarios. And if you come to the modern era, back in 1980, Howard Zinn wrote A People's History of the United States. And this is the textbook that has, in the modern era, really changed a lot of people's perspectives. For those of us that maybe, and I'm saying those of us, it wasn't me, I'm not quite that old, but if you went to school before 1980, you would have had a very different perspective of America than those that went after Howard Zinn's influence really began to take over. Now, if you have never read Howard Zinn's book, then you're winning already. But if you have read his book, he goes through and makes the argument that everybody you think is a hero in America actually was evil. And he starts with Columbus, and he goes through George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Everybody you know, they were really, really evil people. They shouldn't be honored, right? Which also is significant because when we came to the time over the last couple years when there were riots in some of these cities and college campuses and they were tearing down statues, well, where did kids learn to hate some of these people in America? It goes back to the foundation that he laid, and the foundation really, it became known as deconstructionism. And it's part of a Marxist idea. And the deconstruction is what was built is evil and must be torn down. And so he started this movement to tear these things down. It's also why, if you've paid attention in history for the last 60 years, the founding fathers have been villainized. If you go back to the 60s and 70s, the founding fathers were these really immoral guys who had all these affairs, right? These sexual miscreants and all these illegitimate children, which is not true, but this is the accusations. If you go to the 80s and 90s, the leading accusations were the founding fathers that they weren't religious. In fact, many of them hated God, and they were atheists, agnostics, and deists, and they wanted a separation of church and state. They wanted a secular government, and again, this leading prevailing narrative, the founding fathers hated God. We'll come to the 2000s, the present. The prevailing narrative is the founding fathers were racist, bigoted slaveholders. For 60 years, they've been villainized. Why? It's not by accident. It's been very intentional because unless you can demonize the founding fathers, you can never remove the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, things that are under attack today. But if you can first demonize the founding fathers, then the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that's just fruit from the poisonous tree. This has been a very intentional move, and yet what is one of the great ironies is that even though we have a rising generation thinking America is one of the most evil nations ever, they know so little about American history in general. It is staggering, and this is not just an incrimination on the rising generation, it's actually America at large. Because we have heard people's names, we often think we know those stories. But the reality is, if you just pay attention, every summer we'll see this a lot because every 4th of July, there will be different organizations that will do man on the street interviews. And if you remember back in the day, Jay Leno used to do jaywalking, right? Will Witt did it at Prager University. Jesse Waters did it with Waters World. They would go out and interview people. And I want to just show you, this is just from a couple years ago. I want to show you an interview. Now, this is around 4th of July, and the reason it matters around 4th of July is because usually people are asking questions, and they're kind of man-on-the-street interviews about America. And so what do you know about America? Seemingly basic questions. I want to show you this video, and just pay attention to how little people actually know about America.
What country famously broke away from England to start their own country in the late 1700s?
I have no idea, man. I don't know.
What are we celebrating on the 4th of July exactly?
Our independence.
A little more specific.
It's the day that we overtook the South. And it's the day that, it's our independence. That's why we have the fire.
From the South.
From the South, exactly.
So it was the victor of the Civil War?
Yes.
4th of July?
Yes.
The Declaration of Independence was signed by who?
I don't know.
Just name one person.
Abraham Lincoln? I don't know.
Sorry.
Not?
What year was that Declaration of
Was it
Independence?
1964? 84?
1984.
84? I don't know.
No. We're in
1864?
trouble. 1860.
I don't know.
This country, no wonder this country's in trouble.
Okay.
Okay. What country did we declare our independence from?
Help me, baby.
Nope, just you. You're on your own.
California. California.
From.
Oh, from?
We declared independence from a certain country, which is why we celebrate 4th of July. What country was that?
I have no idea.
You're going to be celebrating, though?
Yes. Yes.
But you don't know what you're celebrating.
You're right. You're right.
Okay. That's tonight's homework assignment.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, this is the reality, right? We have Americans that are still willing to celebrate the 4th of July, and yet we know so little about it. Now, again, why does this matter? Because the rising generation, more than any other generation before them, they're learning, like, founding fathers were evil, America's bad. You don't even know who these people were, right? You don't know what they did or didn't do. We're learning accusations. We're not learning the actual stories, right? And in fact, even right now in public schools in America, in many states, they have already stopped teaching the Declaration of the Constitution and Bill of Rights. They don't want students to learn that anymore, which is actually kind of logical based on the fact we're trying to produce socialists and Marxists and communists in America. I understand why you don't want to study the Declaration, Constitution, and Bill of Rights. But the reason I say this is because it is important that we at least learn the story, because one day you're gonna have to tell your kids, your grandkids, right? What was the American experiment really about? Or maybe even who did we separate from? Well, that was King George III, right? England. Why did we separate? Because he thought he was God, right? He thought that he was the one that determined the rights of individuals and citizens. He was the one that got to choose who could go to church and who could go to Walmart. And nope, we said, we're not doing that. We're doing something different now. Why does this matter? Is because if you look at the Declaration of Independence, a lot of people would have a hard time explaining this, and I want to give you what I think is the easiest and best explanation for the time one day you're going to have to explain this to friends, kids, grandkids. Here's, to me, the easiest explanation. The Declaration of Independence was the greatest breakup letter ever written, where we're like, hey, it's not working out anymore, and to be clear, it's not us, it's all you, here's all your problems, right? This is what the Declaration was. Okay, now, it's also worth noting that when the Declaration was done, the primary author of the Declaration was Thomas Jefferson, who was 33 years old. And put on your kid hat for a minute, because I remember as a kid when my parents were in their 30s, and I was like, they're so old. I mean, you remember as a kid, right? And I'm well past 33 now. I'm in my 40s, and what we all learned, you are not innately brilliant. Like, it's not an inherent brilliance you get when you become 30 years old, 33 years old, okay? But when you're young, you feel like that's really special. Now, the reason, again, this matters is because you had a 33-year-old articulate the political philosophy of this nation in one of the most brilliant fashions ever. What Jefferson did, in fact, the second paragraph, the phrase that we know so well, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, the governments are instituted among men deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. That phrase is a phrase that probably many of us had to memorize in American schools. That is a phrase that is no longer being memorized. In fact, I'll tell you part of why in some states they've gone against it. But here's what's worth noting. Why did we have to memorize that phrase? Because it used to be, we wanted people to know the basic concepts of why did America become America? And here's the way it started. The founding fathers, in the midst of their disagreements, because they argued for weeks at times, like on end, just debating, couldn't get along. And when they finally come together on this, Jefferson says, let me see if I can put together all the ideas we've been debating and talking about. It starts off like this. We hold these truths to be self-evident. In the midst of their debates, their frustrations, their confusions, Jefferson said, we still have common ground. Our common ground, we know some things are still true. Again, this becomes important. Why does the imperative to defend truth, why does this become so significant for us? Because if truth doesn't exist, what do we rally around? How do we unite American people again, right? If truth is just subjective, it's, well, this is my truth. No, guys, truth actually does exist. There are some things we know fundamentally are true. This was for the founding fathers. They said, okay, there's some things, we know these truths are self-evident. And the idea they said they're self-evident, to them, it was like, these are the ones that are so obvious, nobody should be debating this. And what was so obvious? They said that we're created equal. That we have rights that come from God, that government exists to protect those rights. These are the obvious things. Here's what's interesting. I mentioned a lot of states have moved away from having students memorize and learn these anymore. In Louisiana, a couple years ago, my dad and I went to testify in a committee there was a bill that was to require that every single student read Declaration, Constitution, Bill of Rights, memorize portions, because it was already part of curriculum, but they said, we want to make sure that nobody can take this away, that no school district can choose, we're not going to do this. So they wanted to require it from state law, you're required to do this. So we want to testify in the committee about the value of studying historic documents, why that mattered, so then you're not taking somebody else's word for it. And so we do this presentation, we felt very confident about it. We go and sit down, and they begin to debate in committee. As they're debating in committee, nobody asked us what we thought, and I was quite disappointed because as they debated in committee, the argument came up, we should never have students memorize that second paragraph because that is incredibly racist. Now, what part do you think is racist? And the representative said, when it says all men are created equal, that's racist. And in my mind, I'm thinking that is the exact opposite of racist. But what they said is, well, because the founding fathers were all white and they all had slaves, and so they were only arguing for equality for white people, not for everybody. Therefore, that was racist, and I don't want our students to have to be subjected to memorizing something so racist. And again, my mind, I'm like, oh my gosh. Because the reason we were there was to talk about the significance of having students learn from original documents so that you couldn't have a subjective interpretation that was opposite than the meaning. Why does that matter? Because if you go back to the actual draft that Jefferson wrote, in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. Now, still, on the first page, this is first page, on the second paragraph starts off right there, we hold these truths. That paragraph was virtually unchanged, okay? On the second page, it starts listing grievances. Third page, listing grievances. Fourth page is where he wraps up his political philosophy. When it goes before Congress, what's interesting is John Hancock was the president of Congress. He said, we'll only include in the final draft what is unanimously agreed to by the body, because if we aren't unanimous on this, the king might be able to come in and pull us apart by our own local separate interests, so we have to be unanimous on this. So they begin debating what's there. In the original draft, just to kind of give context, there were 24 grievances in the original draft. Now, the final draft had 27. So they changed some of that. But in the original draft, there were 24. The final grievance was by far the largest. It was nearly half of the third page. Okay? The last grievance in the Declaration was a grievance against the slave trade, arguing for the humanity of all of those who had been enslaved. And I'm going to read you part of that, but I want to point out, if you can still read cursive, you can get online, you can get a high-res image, right? You can blow this up so you can see it, but it starts off, it says, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating his most sacred rights. Now, I only want you to see that's what's there, because I'm going to put the text up, but this is very, very important. I want to challenge and encourage everybody, please don't believe me. Go look it up, okay? Again, very important. We're talking about truth. You have to understand, truth is not insecure. Truth doesn't mind being questioned. Because if you challenge and question truth, guess what you find? The truth, okay? It's why in Acts 17, when the Apostle Paul was speaking to the Bereans, and the Bereans wouldn't believe him, Paul was like, I love these guys, right? And remember, the Apostle Paul, at this point, as he's trying to share the good news of Jesus, there's no New Testament yet. So logically what he's doing, he's probably going to some of the prophets and talking about these prophecies that talk about the coming Messiah. And so he's probably in Isaiah, which had so many prophecies. And the Apostle Paul says, guys, we know Isaiah prophesied of this. And they were like, wait a second. We don't trust this guy. Somebody get the scroll of Isaiah. And they did. And they bring it out and they read it and they're like, oh, Isaiah did say that. Okay, Paul, you may continue. And he's like, thank you. Well, we know Joel also prophesied. And they're like, wait a second. We don't trust this guy. Somebody get Joel. Like, this is the way it goes for Paul. And Paul's like, I love you guys. Because no one will ever mislead you if you are pursuers of truth. Why does it matter? Because where we are in America today, so many people have relied on somebody else to do the research for them. And we've taken somebody else's word for it. I mean, I vividly remember when internet early 2000s was becoming a real deal, and I had to explain to my mom, I love her, not trying to be disrespectful, but it was like, Mom, come on. When I was like, Mom, just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true, right? Like, people can write things and put it on there, but this is the world we live in. One of the incredible things about this media age is that everybody has a voice. And the worst thing about this age is everybody has a voice, because how do you decipher what's true? And again, truth is not insecure. Even if you love and respect somebody, right? The reality is, Pastor Mike and I mean, this church, what they're doing is incredible. Guys, this is amazing. The leadership, what's happening in this church, and yet, I can tell you that Pastor Mike, if he said, guys, the word of God says this, and you were like, wait, where does it say it? You don't get offended in that moment as a pastor. You're like, well, here's what it says. Because I can tell you, as someone who speaks all the time, I mean, all the time, I know in my head what I'm trying to say. But all of us also who are married, there are times that maybe your spouse is like, that's not what you said. And you're like, oh, it's what I said. Right? And they're like, no, it's not. Yes, well, I know, this is what I was thinking. What if I knew what I was trying to say, but the words weren't quite what I meant, and you just took my word for it when I said it wrong, even though I knew what I meant? The reason you always look it up is because somebody might be very well-intentioned and have said it wrong. And then some people aren't well-intentioned and they intentionally mislead, right? But again, the reason I'm telling you this, truth is not insecure. It is only people that are lying that want to prevent the presentation of truth. So anytime you hear someone say, just trust the science, they're a liar. Not trying to be political, it's not how science works. Okay, let me go back to the declaration, right? The largest grievance, find it online, but here's what it says. It says he has waged cruel war. Now this is talking about the king. This is the king they're talking about. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating his most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Pause. Just to make sure everybody's with me, they're clearly talking about the slave trade. Taking people from one place, right, transporting them, selling them in another place. People are dying along the way. This is a slave trade. It continues. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, pause. Piratical warfare, that's pirates, okay? What pirates do. And it says opprobrium of infidel powers means the behavior of non-believers. Who were the non-believer pirates? They were the Muslims of North Africa who began the exportation of Africans in the North Atlantic slave trade. Okay, this is where the whole thing started, okay? So Jefferson is saying that the king is doing what the Muslim pirates are doing, all right? This is where he continues. He says, the opprobrium of infidel powers is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Now, notice infidel and Christian are both underlined. Jefferson underlined them in the original draft. And the word Christian was the first word not in cursive. He printed it. He was drawing a distinction. It's like putting quotes around it, right? The Christian king of Great Britain. He says to the Christian, he's doing what the Muslim pirates are doing, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. In the original draft, the word men is printed and fully capitalized. Why does this matter? Because Jefferson already wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Who is he talking about? Everybody. Right? And this wasn't like a gender thing. This is mankind. All humans. The reason, again, this matters is the argument in Louisiana, in their state house, was kids shouldn't read this. It's racist. No, if you actually read the original, you would know it was the opposite of racist. Because they were saying that everybody, including those who've been enslaved in this ungodly activity of the slave trade, those people are equal too. Those people have the same God-given rights that we do. Well, the grievance continued. It says he has prostituted his negative. Again, this is the king. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt. What does it mean to suppress a legislative attempt? That is where, if, for example, in a state, if the state legislature passes something, the governor doesn't like it, the governor vetoes it. Or Congress might pass something, the president vetoes it. This is what happened. In 1773, for example, in 1773, there were 4 colonies that passed laws against the slave trade. In 1774, the king vetoed all of them. He said, you're British subjects, you're British colonies. You can't arbitrarily stop something that's a British activity because the British, just like the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Muslims, there were a lot of people making a lot of money off the slave trade. And the king was like, you're not going to stop my money-making factory. And this led people like Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, one of the states that were working to do this. When the king vetoed it, Franklin says, this is one more reason we should separate from the king because he won't even let us in the slave trade in our own colonies. Okay, again, the reason this matters is today people look at the founding fathers and they're like, whoa, they were so racist. The only reason you can think they're racist is because you don't actually know their stories. If you look, and I'm being very sincere, if you look this up, the leading accusation is, well, all the founding fathers were racist, bigoted slaveholders. I spoke at a university at the end of which a professor got up and challenged, hey, how can you suggest that America's good or the founding fathers were honorable people when all the founding fathers had slaves? Now, all is exclusive or inclusive, right? Like that's a pretty significant word. You didn't say the majority of, you said all. And so I repeated just to make sure I know what we're about to debate. I said, are you suggesting that all the founding fathers had slaves? He said, all of them had slaves. Now, if you're gonna suggest that all of them had slaves, I only have to show that one of them didn't to prove you wrong, right? Now, it's also worth pointing out that I really don't mind playing games. I like games, right? I'm competitive, I'm pretty good at them, and actually dumb games sometimes are my favorite. I've also learned over time that, and we tell this to students a lot, when you are in a situation where you have an authority figure making some audacious claims and you feel like you want to push back, I recommend you do it in the form of asking questions where you very humbly are just trying to learn the answer because you don't want it to feel like a power struggle where you're challenging their authority. Right? Because then they're gonna have to get defensive and defend their position of authority because they're the authority. So I always suggest like, hey, oh mighty excellent one, I am a learner and I want to learn more. Can you please teach me in your ways, oh knowledgeable one, right? So this professor, he's like, well, all of them owned slaves. I was like, oh, that's so interesting. I said, are you sure all of them did? He said, all of them. I said, are you sure? He said, oh, all of them. I said, okay, well, what about John Adams? He was like, what about John Adams? I said, are you sure? He had slaves because I'm pretty sure. He never owned slaves and fought against slavery his whole life. He said, well, I don't know about John Adams, but all the others did, right? And I'm like, hey, I'll keep playing your game, right? That's no problem. I'm like, okay, well, what about Sam Adams? Did Sam Adams have slaves? All the others, because I'm pretty sure Sam Adams never had slaves and fought against slavery his whole life. Well, I don't know about Sam Adams, but all the others. And this is in a room full of people. And so people are laughing now. They're realizing the joke. Like this guy doesn't actually know who did and who didn't have slaves. Well, I get about 4 or 5 founding fathers deep into this game before he finally says, okay, I don't actually know who had slaves and who didn't, but the majority of them did. And again, I'm like, you just said you don't know who did and who didn't. But so how do you know the majority? Well, the leading argument is that 41 of the 56 signers of the Declaration at some point in their life owned slaves. I dispute that number just a little bit, having done some research. However, let's go with that number. Let's say 41 of the 56 signers at some point in their life owned slaves. The rest of the conversation is the most significant. I don't know if you remember when I was growing up, he was my favorite to listen to, a guy named Paul Harvey, where Paul Harvey would do the rest of the story, right? And I would always like to go, okay, so you're saying 41 of 56 had slaves. Let's talk about the rest of the story. How many of those 41 freed their slaves? How many of those 41 came out against slavery, funded abolition societies, worked for abolition societies? Like how many of them changed in their, I don't know that. Right, this is the problem. This is why Benjamin Franklin is a great example. Benjamin Franklin, very noted founding father, he owned slaves and yet no honest historian considers him a racist. Why? because Franklin actually freed his slaves early on. In fact, let me walk you through that progression. So first of all, let me go back. Remember when I told you in 1773, there were 4 colonies that passed laws against the slave trade, right? The king vetoed those in 1774. Well, Franklin writes a letter to the Reverend Dean Woodward in 1773 talking about this growing anti-slavery sentiment in America. This is part of what he writes in that letter. He says, a general disposition to abolish slavery prevails in North America, that many of Pennsylvanians have set their slaves at liberty, and that even the Virginia Assembly, and I love that he says even the Virginia Assembly, because it's like he knows, all of us know, like, guys, even Virginia are kind of getting on board with this, right? Like, shocks all of us. We didn't think it was going to happen. Even the Virginia Assembly have petitioned the king for permission to make a law for preventing the importation of war in that colony. Now notice, he says in Pennsylvania, it's not just the slave trade. He says in Pennsylvania, we're already setting our slaves free. In Virginia, they're trying to stop the slave trade from being a thing in Virginia anymore. And this is where his letter continues. The next sentence becomes really interesting, again, in this conversation. He says, this request, however, will probably not be granted as their former laws of that kind have always been repealed. He's talking about Virginia. Virginia's passing a law to stop the slave trade in Virginia. Notice, he says former laws. What does that mean? This is not the first time they tried it. Have always been repealed. What does that mean? The king has always struck those down. This is a very important part of the conversation that I see almost no modern people talking about, is the incredible anti-slavery sentiment from the majority of the founding fathers. And we can walk through this progression because, again, if you go back to guys like Franklin being a good example, if you look at Franklin and, again, this anti-slavery sentiment, Franklin had slaves. But before he even gets to the Continental Congress Declaration of Independence, Franklin was one of those in Pennsylvania that freed his slaves. So before he even gets there, he frees his slaves. So then he's there through the Revolution. He's there, right, as Jefferson does the Declaration and all this growing movement. Well, in 1774, even before the Declaration, Pennsylvania founds what's considered the first abolition society in America. 1774. Franklin encourages the founding of it. He's only kind of a vocal advocate at this point, not really heavily involved yet, but 11 years later, when he gets to the Constitutional Convention, at this point, he's the old man of the convention. When he is there, at that point in time, he's actually the president of that Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, seeking to end slavery, not just in Pennsylvania, but in all the colonies. Again, why does this matter? Because anybody that knows his story understands that where he started is not where he finished. Okay, now there's a lot of Christian theology thoughts we could have on that as well, right? But understand, when you are trying to define someone by one moment in their life and you're not telling the full story of their journey, for example, John Jay, he was the original Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, but there are several letters from John Jay, again, in this context that to me are very interesting. He wrote a letter in 1776 to one of his friends. He says, it's beginning to occur, and he was a slave owner. He says, it's beginning to occur to many of us slave owners, the hypocrisy of our position that we are fighting for our own independence while enslaving others. Now, we would look at that and go, of course that was hypocritical. Why is it just occurring to them? Because when slavery is the normal condition in the world at the time, it is kind of a revelation for someone to go, hey, maybe this really is wrong. Maybe we shouldn't do it. In 1778, he writes another letter where he says that many have begun to see the error of their position and have begun freeing their slaves and are working to end slavery. At the end of the Revolution, not only had he freed his slaves, he reached out, and again, this is all in his writings. You can go find all these letters online. He writes a letter to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, to Benjamin Franklin, and he says, I would like to know what y'all did to start your Abolition Society in Philadelphia, because I want to start one in New York City. And he did. He became the founder of the Abolition Society in New York. John Jay, original Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And again, I'm pointing this out because this was the position of the vast majority of the founding fathers, even the ones that had slaves. They came out against slavery. But the original grievance, the longest grievance against the slave trade, arguing for the humanity of slaves, it didn't make it in the final draft of the Declaration. Jefferson actually wrote about this with great remorse. He said there were 2 colonies that opposed it when that grievance came up in the convention. He said Georgia and South Carolina both said that they had never tried to pass laws against the slave trade. Therefore, this wasn't a grievance they had, so they didn't think it should be included. But what's interesting, he says those two opposed it. The other 11 voted in favor of it. The vast majority of the founding fathers came out against not just slave trade, but against slavery, and it's very well documented, but that's not the narrative people hear today. And again, if you go back, when we go to the Declaration, right, this is the second paragraph of the Declaration, this is what they're gathering, uniting around, this is their philosophy. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Again, self-evident means obvious. If we all look at this list, we would all go, well, yeah, those are all obvious things. But I want you to think about this for a second. How obvious are these things? The idea that we are created equal. Do you know in India to this day, they still have a class system? Because a huge majority of the population believes in reincarnation. And you come in at different classes. If you go to any major Muslim nation in the Middle East, they don't believe in equality between male and female, much less between people of Islamic faith and anybody else. Equality is not the normal thought for the majority of the world. The idea that we have God-given rights, I'm not sure that our own members of Congress in America really believe that well in God-given rights anymore, but for sure. You think in China? You think in North Korea? I mean, like, let's go through this. You think that their government leaders, their dictators, their presidents, right, their premiers, whoever it is, you think they believe in God-given rights? No. Or the idea that government's main job is to protect our rights? These are not normal thoughts, and I'll go further. When they said these truths are self-evident, well, they clearly weren't self-evident to the king, which is why we were separating. So when they said these truths are self-evident to who? This is interesting. Those truths are only self-evident to people that know what the Bible says. This is important. Because where do we get the idea that we are created equal? Genesis 1:26 and 27, that God made them in his image. Male and female, he created them. Okay? Also, that seems to clarify the gender debate, but not the point of right now, right? Male and female, he created them, right? Value does not come from your gender, your nationality, your ethnic heritage. No, like, understand, I'm not trying to knock any of that, but that value comes from the fact that we're all God's kids. This notion that we are created equal is something the founding fathers understood because it's what the Bible teaches, or the idea that we have God-given rights. Where does that happen? Well, Adam and Eve, let's just start there in the Garden of Eden. God began giving them rights way before there's ever a government institution. God gave them the freedom of speech, the freedom of religious choice, right? Because God said there's all these fruits and the trees of the garden, but don't eat this one. God's letting them choose me or some other way. God was already giving them rights, and it's so clear as you study the Bible, starting in Genesis, going way forward. And if you actually look, when in Scripture is the very first time that God gives any kind of civil ordinance to government? Well, the first one that you can find in Scripture happens in Genesis 9. It's after the ark lands on Mount Ararat. Noah gets off, and this is what became known as part of the Noahic covenant, the Noahide laws, they became known as. But the very first command that God gives to man pertaining to civil government is, if man sheds blood, by man his blood will be shed. Right? So if there's a murderer out there, then society come together, right? And society says, we're not allowing murder to happen. Why? Because that murder is taking away someone's God-given right to life. So government is going to protect the rights of man. This is what we see in Scripture, and this is what even early founding fathers are writing and talking about. Now again, why does all this matter? Because if we look back to the Declaration, where did these ideas come from? Well, we see them in Scripture, right? But where did the founding fathers get these ideas? This is where it's kind of interesting going back to early historians who were very clear about this. Clinton Rossiter was a professor at Cornell University. He wrote a book called The Seed Time of the Republic, and in his book, he identified that every major thought that led to American freedom and independence, it came from one of six people he believed and argued. He said the six most influential people are Benjamin Franklin, Richard Bland, the Reverend Thomas Hooker, the Reverend Roger Williams, the Reverend John Wise, and the Reverend Jonathan Mayhew. He said those are the six people who came up with the ideas that led to American independence. It's worth noting that 4 of the 6 he found were pastors. Most people today couldn't tell you even who those pastors were, right? We don't know most of those names, but to show the significance of what they contributed, let me just give you an easy example. John Wise. John Wise was a pastor from Ipswich, Massachusetts, back in the late 1600s to early 1700s. The last collection of sermons of his that came out was 1717. Now, this is way before the Declaration of Independence. So how do we get from 1717 to the Declaration of Founding Fathers? Well, let me first show you some of his sermons, and I'm gonna walk you through how it got there. In his sermons of 1717, he preached a sermon where he said that taxation without representation is tyranny. He continued that God's preferred form of government was to consent of the governed, and then he said that all men are created equal and have certain inalienable rights from their creator. If you're familiar with the Declaration, all of those phrases are in the Declaration. How did his sermons from 1717 make it into the Declaration? Well, because his sermons were reprinted in 1772. Well, why were they reprinted? Well, there was a group at that time called the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty, they were trying to rally the other patriots in all the other colonies, and they said, how can we help them understand what we understand? And one of the Sons of Liberty said, hey, have you guys read these sermons from Pastor Wise? Because they're from Massachusetts, Sons of Liberty were. And they read them, they go, okay, those, we should reprint those sermons. And they reprinted those sermons, and they distributed them to the 13 colonies. Here's where it gets even more interesting. 1776 comes around. The Founding Fathers get together, and they're spouting these ideas verbatim. When the Founding Fathers died, and historians went through and they identified the items in their libraries, every Founding Father whose libraries were preserved had John Wise's sermons in them, which means they'd all read them. When you get to 1776, every Founding Father knows exactly who John Wise is. And Jefferson puts it in the Declaration. In fact, it was so obvious to earlier generations who John Wise was, his influences, that you can go to historian B.F. Morse. 1864, now this was way after the Declaration. 1864, he said, some of the most glittering sentences in the immortal Declaration of Independence are almost literal quotations from this essay of John Wise. It was used as a political textbook in the great struggle for freedom. Now, all I want to do is help you identify that earlier generations, historians used to know, like this was obvious. It was evident that John Wise was a very important person influencing the Founding Fathers. Even if you go to Calvin Coolidge, who's a president, arguably the most underrated president in American history, but Calvin Coolidge on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration went back to Independence Hall, which is where the Declaration had originally been drafted. He gave a speech. You can find his whole speech online, and it's a good speech. But part of what he said in this speech is the thoughts in the Declaration can very largely be traced back to what John Wise was writing. Here was a doctrine of equality of popular sovereignty and inalienable rights asserted by Wise. So where did all these ideas come from? They came from John Wise, and it used to be very, very well known. Well, today, most people don't know that, but again, it's because we don't really know the Founding Fathers. If we talk about Sam Adams, Sam Adams was known as, which, by the way, 1772, he's one of the guys responsible for reprinting John Wise's sermons, okay? So he's kind of a big deal. He was known as the father of the American Revolution. If you ask most Americans today, what do you know about Sam Adams? The only thing they know is there's a beer named after this guy, right? Now, it's kind of sad for his legacy, right? The Sons of Liberty, they were kind of a big deal in America becoming America. Whether you're talking about the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, like this was all the things leading into the Sons of Liberty. But what's worth noting in this conversation, Sam Adams, parts of the Sons of Liberty, they come up with the idea, James Otis did, but was kind of the initial guy behind this, one of the Sons of Liberty, but they come up with the idea that we should have what they called committees of correspondence. They called them a circular letter. They said, if we're gonna all get on the same page, we have to have a communication together so we all know what each other's thinking. And so they said, we should write this committee of correspondence, and we're gonna send it to all the colonies so they can all see what we're thinking. So Sam Adams was commissioned with writing the very first ever committee of correspondence, the very first circular. His very first one he did that was sent to all the colonies that had 3 sections to it. It was the rights of the colonists as men, the rights of the colonists as Christians, and the rights of the colonists as British subjects. Those were his 3 sections. Well, the second section was the rights of the colonists as Christians. Now, what's he gonna say in this? Because this is when they're trying to get all the colonies to work together, to come together, to think together. And what he says, the opening sentence in this section, He says, the rights of the colonists as Christians may be best understood by reading and carefully studying the institutes of the great lawgiver and head of the Christian church, which will be found clearly written and promulgated in the New Testament. Now, who is the head of the Christian church? Jesus. He said, if you want to understand what we're thinking in this section, you should read the New Testament and study the life of Jesus, because that's how we're thinking. Okay, anytime someone says the founding fathers were secular, atheists, agnostics, and deists, they clearly have not read the founders' writings. And that's not even the point of this conversation today. If that was the point, I would go through dozens and dozens and dozens of quotes and letters where they talk about this. But here's what I want to point out. If you look at the founding fathers today, the idea the founding fathers were influenced by pastors, that they were encouraging people to read and know the Bible, that this is where their ideas were coming from, that seems far-fetched for most Americans. And again, it's because most Americans, they've heard the names and they don't know the story. If we actually knew the story, for example, everybody knows the name John Adams, largely speaking in America, right? But if I asked stories about John Adams, most people don't know the story. Well, one of the things I can tell you, if you go through John Adams' writings, he talks about faith quite often in his writings. And this is one of the things he wrote that is quite profound when you start thinking what he really is saying. I've examined all religions, and the result is that the Bible is the best book in the world. Now, before we get to the Bible being the best book in the world, he said, I've examined all religions, okay? Most Christians don't even know what they should believe or why they should believe it. Much less have we delved into what everybody else believes, which is one of the reasons I would highly encourage the study into apologetics, right? What we should believe as Christians, how we defend it, why. When the Apostle Paul says, be ready to give an answer for the hope that is in you, right? A defense, the apologia, where we get the word apologetics for the hope that is in you, there's a reason for that. But if you look at this, he says, I've examined them all, and there's nothing like the Bible. He then went further. He said, suppose a nation in some distant region should take the Bible for their only law book, and every member should regulate his conduct by the precepts there exhibited. Meaning, imagine if there was a place and they said, we're just going to do what the Bible says. We're going to follow the Bible. That's what we're going to do. He says, imagine what that place would be like. This is what he concluded from that thought. What a utopia, what a paradise would this region be if people would just live by the Bible. Now, we could go as far as say, like, if Chicago would just live by the 10 Commandments, right? Like, that would help a lot. This is John Adams, okay? Saying the Bible, most valuable. If we would just live by it, everything is going to be better. Well, I can point out his son said something also quite interesting in connection to this. His son, John Quincy Adams, who goes on to become the 6th president, right? But he grows up in the founding era. He knows all the founding fathers. And he explained the way that he had learned and viewed the Bible. And he said, with regard to the history contained in the Bible, it is not so much praiseworthy to be acquainted with it as it is shameful to be ignorant of it. It's not impressive to know the Bible, but it should be embarrassing if you don't know the Bible. Well, in a modern culture, it's kind of gone the exact opposite direction, right? That if you don't know the Bible, you don't need to be embarrassed. You're normal. You fit in with everybody else. But think about it. The people that so often we respect in faith and theology, they're the people that really know the Word of God. It used to be that made them normal, not special. In America, in fact, in this room, if I were to ask any educated adult, what's 2 + 2? It would not be impressive for an educated adult to know that 2 + 2 is 4, but it would be embarrassing if you didn't know that. That's the way the Bible used to be. It wasn't impressive for you to know what should have been obvious. Well, why did he think it should have been obvious? Again, this is the way he was raised. You study John and Abigail Adams, and they really are a fun couple to study. They're one of the most remarkable couples, like ideal couple, right? Early America, super fun. And they have over 1,100 letters between each other, like from the Revolution going forward. A ton of letters. You want to read them. And if you are someone who likes Hallmark movies, you should read their letters, okay? Now, I'm giving that as a caveat because if you don't like their movies, you just know what you're getting into, okay? Because John Adams has this letter where, and this is one of many examples, but this letter, he starts off and he says, Abigail, I'm suffocating because I haven't seen you in over a week and you are the air that I breathe. Yeah, see, the awes, Hallmarkers, I know it, okay? Right? He's like, you're my sunrise in the morning, my sunset in the evening. I mean, this is his letters. And at some point, I'm like, bro, you got her. Like, you win, right? It's okay. Nonetheless, this is his letters. Well, if you go in their letters, there's so many fascinating stories as he's telling her what he's seen and she's explaining what she's living through and what they're dealing with. But as the revolution unfolds, John Adams becomes one of, if not the, at times, top diplomat for America. So he's gone. Almost the whole revolution, which means Abigail is at home running the family farm, like taking care of business at home, taking care of all the kids. She's single momming it for a long time. There's times he's gone for the full year, 7, 8 months of the year in a row. I mean, it's not an easy life for her. What's so cool though is the church where their family went is still in existence today up in Massachusetts. And outside the church, they erected a statue of Abigail Adams with her son, John Quincy Adams, showing them walking into church because what was so well known and documented is they never missed service, right? And you could think, if anybody had a reason to, right? John Adams, he's overseas and mom's like, hey, let's take the morning off. Nope, she was always gonna be in church. And with them being so faithful in church, this is the way John Quincy Adams grows up. And to add even a little more perspective, this is him as a very young man. And I love this picture because it only further confirms that everybody had a bad yearbook photo, right? Like this is the one, his cute wig, powdered up. But as he's growing up, the American Revolution unfolds. After the shot heard around the world, 6 weeks later, you have the Battle of Bunker Hill. He was 6 years old. He was in town when this happens. He and his mom go out on an adjacent hill and they watch the Battle of Bunker Hill. They watched their family friend and their personal doctor, Dr. Joseph Warren. He got wounded in that battle. After he was wounded, he fell down. The battle's over. The British, instead of taking prisoners, they were so angry it took them 3 charges to win the hill. Instead of taking prisoners, they came over and they bayoneted him to death. And 6-year-old John Quincy Adams watched their family friend and doctor get what they called murdered. That'll grow you up pretty quick, right, in that kind of environment. Well, when he was 8 years old, his dad came home one day. The Massachusetts Minutemen used to practice their drills in front of John Adams' home. And John Adams came home and he got a musket, gave it to his 8-year-old son and said, you need to go out and start training with them because there's no telling when you're gonna have to know how to use this as an 8-year-old. Now, again, that'll grow you up pretty quick, that reality. I can also tell you that would have been one of the coolest things ever as an 8-year-old boy. Right? Are you kidding me? Dad let me go train with the Navy SEALs, right? Force Recon Marines, Green Berets, like, yeah, I'm ready, I'm in. Well, this is the world he grows up in. When he was 10 years old, he went with his dad on a diplomatic mission. And what's really fun, there's a letter from Abigail to John Quincy Adams where she writes him, and apparently he was supposed to write her when he got there, like, hey mom, I'm here, I'm safe, dad's feeding me, we're okay. And he apparently did not write the letter, or she at least had not received it by the time she wrote her letter, because she writes this letter and she starts off with like, I'm not even sure if you're alive, but if you are, you're in trouble, because you were supposed to write me and let me know you got there. I mean, definitely, right, the mom thought has never changed, right, throughout history, that now we call and text mom, but either way, right? So she goes to this letter, but then she reminds him, says, look, you're over in France, and they have a very different set of values than we do in America and than we do in our family. You make sure you don't get pulled into what they're doing. And this is part of what she wrote in the letter. She said, adhere to those religious sentiments and principles which were early instilled into your mind. And remember, you are accountable to your maker for all your words and actions, right? So, hey, just because I'm not there doesn't mean God's not watching, because he sees everything you're doing, right? Again, like the mom thought right now. Well, then she goes further. She says, dear as you are to me, I had much rather you should find your grave in the ocean or an untimely death crop you in your infant years rather than see you an immoral, wicked, or graceless child. Wait, I hope you drown in the ocean, love, mom. What? Now, what's so cool to me about this, the Bible tells us, Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way they should go. When they're old, they won't depart from it. What is she doing? She's instilling an eternal perspective in him as a kid. It would be better for you to be well connected to Christ and die early than to reject Christ and live to a long old age, right? Because one is far better that you know when you're connected to Christ. She's instilling an eternal perspective in him. Again, like this is just the way he grows up. Well, when he was 11, he received an official congressional appointment to be the official secretary to America's diplomat to Paris. Well, America's diplomat to Paris was his father. So, right, you might could argue, well, I think that was just nepotism. Well, maybe, although I can point out back then, most kids finished school between 11 and 13 years old. and what they had accomplished at that point. If you were here this morning, right? If in first grade you're memorizing the book of John, that's a different kind of education, okay? So I think that he probably was very talented as an 11-year-old, but part of the reason I make that argument is because when he was 14, he received a second congressional appointment. This time, he was part of the diplomatic staff before the throne of Catherine the Great in Russia, and he wasn't somebody's secretary. He was part of the team. He had an actual job. His job, he was the official interpreter for the delegation. Because as a 14-year-old, he was already fluent in 6 languages. I'm still working on my first, right? I mean, this is super crazy. Well, this is just how he grows up. He's very active in America becoming a nation. And actually, when George Washington becomes president, George Washington chose John Quincy Adams to be one of America's diplomats. When George Washington finished his presidency, he wrote a letter where he said that John Quincy Adams is the best diplomat America has. Well, when John Adams becomes president, again, John Quincy Adams, America's top diplomat. When John Adams finishes his presidency, he and Jefferson had this major falling out. And so John Quincy Adams calls his son home and he's like, I'm not letting you work for that guy, right? So you come home. Well, so he wasn't a diplomat under Jefferson, but he did become a U.S. senator under Thomas Jefferson. Then when James Madison became president, he again chose John Quincy Adams to be America's top diplomat. And then when James Monroe became president, he became the Secretary of State, after which he became the 6th president of the United States. He had the most impressive resume of any president in American history with what he had done, who he knew, all he had accomplished. What's interesting though is after he was president, he did something no other president has ever done in American history. After being president, he was elected to Congress. Now, there have been some presidents who have been congressmen first, but nobody's been a president and gone back to Congress because that would be a pretty significant demotion, right? That's like being a starter on varsity and then going and sitting on the JV team, right? That's the opposite direction politically, but John Quincy Adams said, there is a great evil that must be remedied. And he became the leader of the anti-slavery movement in Congress. In fact, they gave him the nickname the Hellhound of Abolition because he locked his teeth so much into this issue. This was the one thing he cared about, that he fought for the last 17 years of his life. He was in Congress fighting against slavery, trying to end slavery in America. Well, as he's fighting in slavery, he said when he first got there that Congress, probably only about 20% of Congress was really ardent against slavery. Because he said, right, there's some people that are really in favor of slavery, and then there's this huge majority that's just complacent. They don't really care what happens. So there's only about 20% of us that are really against slavery. Well, he, as the leader of the anti-slavery movement, the First Amendment says you can petition Congress for a redress of grievances. And so as a leader of the movement, when people would write petitions against slavery, he presented all of those petitions as the leader of the anti-slavery movement. There was one day, the records show that he brought over 900 petitions against slavery. And at the time, it was still a pro-slavery Congress. So they went to the Rules Committee and they made a brand new rule. The rule said that you cannot talk about any issue we've already voted on, specifically, this is in the rule, specifically slavery. Those words are the end of that rule. So it was targeting slavery, saying, we're not gonna talk about this issue again, right? We've already told you no, we're not doing this again. The rule became known as the John Quincy Adams gag order because it was specifically done just to shut this dude up. Well, he didn't stay shut up. He continued to bring these and they reprimanded him. They censored him. They tried to expose him from Congress for breaking the rules of the assembly, but he was committed. He wasn't going to stop. One day a reporter came to him and said, Mr. Adams, you have fought for all these years against slavery and there have been no visible signs of success. How can you stay motivated when you haven't achieved anything you set out to achieve? His response was really brilliant. His response was based on his life motto. He said his life motto is duty is ours, results are God's. What he told the reporter who asked that question, he said, it's only up to me to do the right thing. It's up to God what happens after that. Well, he continued to do the right thing. And as you know, in Congress, every 2 years, there's freshmen elected to Congress. And so as he is there for 17 years, every 2 years, there's new freshmen elected. Well, his last term in Congress, there was a freshman elected. And at this point, the anti-slavery movement is a very strong movement, very strong in Congress. Actually, the tide of Congress has shifted. Over 17 years now, the majority of the members of Congress are more on the side against slavery than they are actually arguing for slavery. So they rescind the gag order. He's making incredible progress. But one day he got up. They thought he was going to give a speech. He clutched his chest. He fell down over his desk. He had a stroke, a heart attack. He died in the Capitol building. Well, this young freshman who had been elected had been mentored by him, hearing all these speeches for month after month after month. And so when John Quincy Adams dies, there's so many people fired up and motivated because John Quincy Adams was the face, politically speaking, of the anti-slavery movement. Now, again, there were lots of noted people in the movement at this time, but he's the most noted member of Congress leading this political movement against slavery. And this freshman decides, I want to carry on. I'm going to help. So this freshman ran after 2 years for his reelection bid, and he got defeated. Not to be discouraged, he ran again. Got defeated a second time. He then ran for U.S. Senate and got defeated. He then ran for state office and got defeated. And this freshman did not win another election until he became the president of the United States. And what's interesting, Abraham Lincoln is a guy credited with ending slavery, right? All he did, Emancipation Proclamation, leading then to the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. What's so fascinating, though, is what Abraham Lincoln gets credit for is a strategy he learned from John Quincy Adams. Now, what's significant for us, John Quincy Adams fought his entire life for something he never saw realized. And I would argue he probably had no idea that God allowed him to mentor some of the very people that were going to accomplish everything that God had put on his heart. But his motivation was, I'm just going to do what I know is right, and I'm going to leave the results in God's hands. This is what's known as transgenerational, right? Had John Quincy Adams not intentionally found and worked with a rising generation to pass on wisdom, knowledge, and insight, because the further details, when Abraham Lincoln became president, he began starting several things where he first abolished slavery in Washington, D.C. It's federal territory, something he had control over. He then did the Emancipation Proclamation, which abolished slavery in all the states that were in the rebellion in the Confederacy, not all states in general, and then he did push for the 13th Amendment. That was the strategy that John Quincy Adams had taught in Congress to the anti-slavery movement. Literally, this was a strategy he had taught those following his leadership. And again, the reason all this matters, he didn't live long enough to see this. But God allowed him to mentor the very people that got it done. And I would say for those in the room who are in an older generation, and I'm not going to put an age to it, you get to figure that out. It's the only time I let you self-identify, right? What generation you're part of, that's up to you. But if we don't start thinking transgenerationally, this is where you can lose. Because if your knowledge, your wisdom, your insight dies with you, then the next generation doesn't have the understanding, the game plan, the strategy if somebody doesn't pass it on to them. It also means for those in a younger generation, you need to look for those with the wisdom, the strategy, the game plan, those that are involved. Now, with all this being said, we can go a long time with some of these thoughts, but I want to point out John Quincy Adams is one of the most impressive people in American history. In fact, I would argue he's one of the only individuals in American history you can study as much as you want. You will never find a major moral failing or character flaw in his life. It's fascinating. Almost everybody else. Now, George Washington, I think, is kind of a close second, and people would argue, well, yeah, but he had slavery, and I would say, okay, name a political leader in the 1700s that didn't have slavery. But even George Washington's position evolved in his lifetime, that he came out against slavery later on in his life. He signed the very first ever federal law that said, it was Northwest Ordinance, that no new territories could come and be part of the Union if they had slaves. So he actually became very anti-slavery later in his life, which is also why the abolitionists in the 1830s and 40s, they cited Jefferson and Washington as two of the most vocal, ardent anti-slavery advocates at the end of their life. Most people don't think about this. Anyway, all that to say is these guys are literally amazing. If we go through and just started learning some of the stories, we would realize these people are so much more impressive than most of us knew, but we don't know their stories anymore. And why that's really silly is because today we live in this era where the modern narrative is, yeah, but America's bad and the founding fathers were evil. This is the modern narrative. As we finish, I want to give you a couple thoughts on this. First of all, anytime we hear something, I'm going to always suggest the first thing we should always do is go to the Bible and get guidance from the Bible, right? Well, let's talk for a second about who are some of the leaders, some of the heroes of the Bible. Let me just take one right now. King David. Now, King David, very, very remarkable guy because he's the only one, the Bible only called one person a man after God's own heart. Right? And if you know David, right? I mean, really, genuinely incredible. He killed lions and he killed bears at a young age because before he ever goes and kills Goliath, when Saul's like, I think you're too young, and David's like, it's no problem. Whenever I was watching my dad's sheep and a lion or bear came, I would chase them down and I would kill them. This giant will be no different, right? Remember, this is the setup. Scholars think David was between 14 and 17 years old when he killed Goliath. If he was 14, he was killing lions and bears at 11, 12, 13 years old. That's crazy. And he had a stick and a rock, right? This isn't like he has some high-powered rifle. This is a kid with a stick and a rock. David was really good at killing stuff. David also was an incredible worshiper, right? A man after God's own heart. He writes the majority of the book of Psalms. I mean, just incredible what David did. Well, this is a really good part of David's life. The Bible doesn't stop with a story, right? Now, there's some younger ears in the room, so I'm not going to give all the details of this, but if you study David's kids, right? Amnon does a really, really bad thing. You can go look it up later, right? David does nothing, right? Absalom is so mad that his dad does nothing. Absalom says, I'm going to take care of this. Absalom kills Amnon. David does nothing. Absalom starts to think, my dad's a terrible leader. Absalom sets himself up at the city gates where judges would go to set themselves up. He's like, man, it's too bad my dad doesn't take care of you. If you came to me, I'd solve all your problems. He begins to elevate himself in the people's eyes. Once he feels like he has that position, he leads a violent revolt against his father to take the throne back, right? As this happens, what does David do? He runs. At this point, the Bible's already told us about David's mighty men. One of them by himself to fill into the bead patch against 1,000 people. David didn't have to run from nobody. Right? David ran. At some point, you can only imagine that David's men were like, please just turn us loose. Like, over the weekend, we'll solve this problem. This is not a big deal. We'll kill him. You're back on the throne. It's easy. David finally lets his men go to war. Absalom gets his hair caught in a tree. David's men use him as javelin practice. He's done. It then says Adonijah wanted the throne from his father. So Adonijah began to position himself. And in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 6, it says, Adonijah, comma, the son whom David never corrected. The Bible tells us the father disciplines the son he loves, right? David was an absent, unloving father at best. This is a really bad part of David's life. And arguably, it might not even be the worst part of David's life. Because the Bible tells us about a time when kings go to war, and David stayed home, and from his balcony, he saw this woman of unusual beauty bathing, right, Bathsheba, and they have the affair, and she gets pregnant, and then he has Uriah murdered, has this dude bumped off. David is an adulterer and a murderer. First thing I want to draw your attention to is the Bible unapologetically tells the whole story. It tells the good, the bad, and the ugly. If the only thing you know is bad and ugly, you might not know the whole story. But also, if the only thing you know is good, you might not know the whole story, right? But the Bible unapologetically tells us the whole story. Here's where it gets more interesting. Modern culture says that we can't celebrate people that have done bad things, and yet, tonight, we were singing words directly out of Psalms that were written by a murdering, adulterous, unloving, absent, terrible father. How can we sing the words from a dude like that? Well, first of all, I will tell you, it should be because as Christians, we don't see the way the world sees. See, we're not conformed to the pattern of this world. We're transformed by the renewing of our mind. And part of the way we renew our mind, what does Scripture tell us? Our starting place as Christians is different than everybody else. It's why as Christians, we can understand history better, more accurately than anybody else in the world because our starting place is things like this. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. What does it mean? It means everybody is jacked up and needs Jesus, right? We're all sinners who need a Savior. So when someone's like, oh, well, can you believe so-and-so did this? Yes, absolutely, right? The reason Jesus came is because there is none righteous, no, not one, right? Now again, why does this matter? Because if my starting place is they weren't perfect, then I don't think they have to be canceled for not being perfect, because that was the obvious part. See, if you look historically, think about some of the people that have been honored historically. Some of the people in this nation, we've celebrated what they accomplished and how they changed the nation. And the modern culture says, yeah, but we can't celebrate people that have done bad things. I want to point out, the reason that we honored these people wasn't because we thought they were perfect. It used to be all of us knew they weren't perfect. See, we never celebrated them because we thought they were perfect. Instead, we celebrated how a perfect God used imperfect people and did great things through them. This is what used to be known. Like, how do we sing the Psalms of David? Because we're not ignorant to the sins of David. We just recognize that God was able to use him and anoint him in what he did in spite of his shortcomings, right? Not because of, in spite of. And this is where I would encourage. If you look in Hebrews chapter 11, we're told without faith, it's impossible to please God, right? And then we're told, look to the heroes of the faith who have gone before us as examples to us, right? That we learn from their life. Have you ever thought about the examples we have in Hebrews 11? I mean, genuinely. You start studying. So Noah, amazing that God's like, hey, so like, there's gonna be something that happens, it's never happened, so like rains never come, you know what that is, don't worry about it. I need you to build this really big boat. Don't build it near water, right? Over here on dry ground. And like, that's a lot of faith to build this really, really big boat. Incredible faith, yes. Noah had amazing faith, sure. Check. Genesis 9, after the ark lands on Mount Ararat, Noah gets off. He becomes a farmer. He plants a vineyard. This is all Bible. Plants a vineyard. Oh, he doesn't just get drunk. The Bible says he gets drunk and passes out naked, right? It's why his sons were like, oh, Dad, what are you doing? Oh, man, right? Sons come and cover him up. Now, I don't know what you do it in your church. In my church, that's inappropriate, right? That will disqualify you from leadership and church staff. This is a hero of our faith. Abraham, amazing faith. God tells him directional, hey, get all your stuff, go that, like not even a specific location, just trust me, follow, I'm gonna tell, like that, amazing faith, yes. Abraham has amazing faith. He's also one of the biggest cowards and liars in the Bible. Because every time he gets before some ruler and leader, he's like, oh, this girl with me, you mean my sister? You can have her. Like, again, I was raised a little bit different. That the role of the husband should be to protect his wife and kids, not to offer them to protect himself. Like, what kind of loser are you? I mean, genuinely, like this dude is a liar and a coward. Moses, he's an actual murderer. Rahab's a prostitute. Samson, womanizer. I mean, like, go down the list, right? David, this adulterer, murderer, absent, unloving father, and these are our heroes. Why does God give us such a jacked up list of heroes? I think one of the reasons is God wanted us to have hope. That we are never going to be disqualified from his service, because if God can use them, God can use us too. Again, this is why as a Christian, we will have the best perspective of history of anybody, because we see the way God works. God has never had a perfect vessel outside of Jesus to work with, meaning God only has messed up people to use. And just because someone is jacked up doesn't mean God can't or won't use them. And if we look back historically, what God used the leaders of this nation, the founders of the nation, everybody from Columbus through the Pilgrims to the founding fathers, God did something amazing with flawed people, even though, again, arguably they're not as flawed as the accusations are today. If we learn their stories, we know that a lot of what's being accused is not historically accurate. But understand, if you study history and you find someone wasn't perfect, that should not be surprising. We never honored them because we thought they were perfect. Instead, we celebrate how a perfect God uses imperfect people. and does great things through them. And this is the reality of our hope as believers. It's part of the good news of the gospel, right? That old things can pass away, all things become new, right? That we're able to crucify the flesh and sinful desires and walk in the Spirit, and we become new creations in Christ Jesus. There's hope for us as believers. Again, this is part of the narrative. As Christians, we can't get sucked into this cancel culture, this nonsense that's not historically accurate, that's rejecting a objective reality of truth, and that's taking an anti-biblical Marxist perspective. We got to make sure as Christians we are thinking biblically on the issue. If you guys want to know more, we've mentioned it before, we have resources that every story I've told, we have all of these in greater detail, footnoted, documented, don't take our word for it. We also have what we call the Founders Bible. For more than 30 years, we've been gathering writings from the Founding Fathers, and this is a normal Bible. But when we found the Founding Fathers writing about how the Bible shaped policy or their life or institutions or government, we put the quote from their letter citing that verse beside that verse. So it's an incredible way as you read the Bible to see how it literally shaped the men who shaped this nation and how the Bible directly impacted that. All that to say is we just want you to know more about what God has done in the history of this nation. Now, I know as we are wrapping things up, we're about to get out of here, but I also know that on Sunday night, it's usually a time of prayer. And I want to ask that as we finish, we take just a moment before everybody leaves, that we take some time and pray. And first of all, I would say, let's pray that we find the calling God has on our own life. God, how do you want to use me? Because I think for some of us, right, it could be easy to fall into that trap, the attack of the devil saying, nope, you're disqualified. I'm gonna tell you tonight, you're not disqualified. God's plan and purpose for your life is greater than any mistake you've made. You're not disqualified. God wants to use you, but sometimes we get very comfortable in our life too. I'm comfortable with what I'm doing. I'm not looking for God to make me do something else. No, we need to ask, God, what do you have for me? What do you want me to do? And then I want to ask that we would take time to pray that God would continue to move in this nation. God is not done with us as the remnant in this nation. God is not done with this nation. God is doing too much in this nation to think that he could be done. But we want to pray, God, how can you use me? What's my part? And we want to pray for this nation. If you'll take a minute where you are, if you want to pray by yourself, and then if you want to get in small groups, I just want to pray for just a little bit before we get out of here. So let's take a little time and let's pray right now.